In all Derelian Centaur's 28 years, he'd never once found anything admirable about mountains. Sweeping vistas of azure sea, dotted with coral-pink islands, enticing. Rolling, verdant hills of patchwork fields and coppiced woods, delightful. Even Kadim Desert, bone-white and blistering hot, had something to recommend it. At least there it never snowed. He trudged to a stop, and the next moment felt a hand thump against his shoulder. "What do you say, laddie? Have you ever seen aught like it?" Derelian scowled down at the dwarf, who'd only reached his shoulder by virtue of standing on a rock. Marcia Ironrock, or Blackhammer, or Lilyliver, whatever his name was in charge of the caravan, but he spent most of his time acting like every traveller's favourite uncle. He also seemed to be determined to be the most dwarven dwarf who'd ever lived. There were plenty of dwarves in Aeterna, and Derelian had even spent time amongst them. He'd never heard a single one call anyone laddie. "What am I supposed to be looking at?" he snapped back. Marcia gestured expansively, taking in the stark white peaks, the grey road snaking between them. Ghoul's Spine, of course. What else? What else indeed? Damn dwarves. They were all obsessed with mountains, and this particular range most of all. Ghoul was supposedly a giant, or a dragon, or some other long-dead creature. Derelian hadn't troubled to learn the details. All he knew was that Ghoul's Spine ran clear across the continent, thousands of leagues of inhospitable rock and ice. Only the dwarves were foolish enough to live here, but what others shunned they were deeply passionate about. The Spine was the heart of dwarven civilization. Derelian didn't think much of said civilization, though. No one with an ounce of sense would choose to live out here. And no one, not even the dwarves, did live in this particular stretch of the Spine. It was deserted from Skyhold in the west to Stonecrown in the east, nothing but hundreds of leagues of emptiness between. Only a handful of roads crossed the Spine from north to south, and only a handful of travellers ever traversed them. Marcia slapped him on the back once more before hurrying off to see to the dozen wagons the pack beasts were hauling up the last slope. Derelian trudged to the side of the road, stepping off and immediately sinking up to his ankles in snow. Even for the bone roads, the travelling season was coming to an end. There'd been fresh snowfall 3 days out of the last 5. He shuddered. If they didn't make it over the pass within the next week, and the blizzards trapped them in one of the corries until spring, it didn't bear thinking about. He waited as the jingling caravan approached the head of the slope. Both beasts and carts alike were strung with bells and streamers, to find them if they were lost in bad weather according to Marcia, and to keep off mountain spirits according to the sorceress. Derelian was particularly wary of the latter. She'd kept largely to herself throughout the journey, for one thing. For another, she was Fae. Fae and elves, as a general rule, didn't mingle. It wasn't that they had nothing in common, but rather the reverse. Elves had evolved from their more primitive brethren, and Derelian liked to think they'd left the more feral aspects of the Fae behind. Being around the still immortal Fae remained uncomfortable, though. Sometimes elven assertions of how different the two peoples were didn't quite hold up to scrutiny. It wasn't usually a problem. Fae were territorial, devoted to their sacred places as they put it, and rarely to be found in mortal cities. Derelian hadn't seen one in years. Until this caravan and the Fae woman who travelled with it. She was a fire mage, according to Marcia, though Derelian had seen no evidence of it for himself. It was better that way, he reminded himself. Just being in her presence put him on edge. No, not just her. This whole damned journey. Damn Eskin and his fool ideas. Couldn't he have been buried in Aeterna? The city had plenty of cemeteries, and many of those that catered to elves were downright grand. And Eskin had been a great scholar. He'd had connections in the Queen's court. With a little negotiation, he could have been buried beside royalty. But instead, Dorelian's old teacher had insisted on this last, pointless journey, across the strait from Isna onto an entirely different continent, south through the Shenzhou Empire, where at least the roads were good even if the people were surly, over this horrendous range of mountains, and finally down into the deep south, where Eskin had apparently grown up. More ice and snow and trees, Dorelian supposed, right up to the edge of the southern ice cap. There was nothing else down there. If he'd had the slightest say in the matter, he would have eschewed this journey entirely. Eskin didn't even believe in an afterlife. He'd made that perfectly clear over the years. The trouble was, in more than one sense, Eskin was dead. Dorelian couldn't argue with him, couldn't change his mind, couldn't do anything except read his last request over and over again. A request that began, "Dorelian, I know it will not please you to receive this letter. I ask, though, that you put aside our differences and do me this one last thing." Yes, differences. That was one way of putting it. If they hadn't had any differences, the sort that had led to them not speaking for nearly a decade, Dorelian wouldn't have been here at all. The caravan had almost passed him, following the curve of the road down into a snow-filled dell. Dorelian fell in behind it, and suddenly found himself walking beside the Fae. She was probably hundreds of years old. Dorelian thought she'd have to be to have such appallingly tangled hair. It sat on her head like a bird's nest, a few charms and feathers pushed into it. It was touched with red around the edges of the dark curls, and her pale skin had the same tint. She lived, Dorelian suspected, somewhere with red rock or red sand or iron in the water. Fae always looked a little like their surroundings, didn't they? Centuries old or not, she strode through the snow without difficulty. She did have a gnarled wooden staff, but she carried it more like a weapon. "It's Dorelian, isn't it, from Isna, carrying your master's body home?" Dorelian sniffed. He supposed she'd found out about Eskin from Marcia, not from reading his thoughts as her kind were rumoured to be able to do. She didn't sound much like a Fae either. No rhymes, no riddles, no ridiculous pronouncements about the weather or the portents. Apart from a slight southern accent, she could have stepped out of the university in Isna. She was also staring at him. "What's the matter? Tongue frozen stiff?" "My tongue is functioning perfectly well, thank you." Dorelian stumbled through a drift, almost treading in a lump of dung left by an oxen. "You just don't have anything in common with an uncouth Fae." "And you have anything in common with an arrogant elf?" He'd spoken without thinking, but the Fae smiled thinly. "You'd be surprised." They'd reached the bottom of the dell, where Marcia was now shouting orders to his assistants, the oxen shaking themselves after being freed from their traces. The Fae came to a stop and sniffed the air, in a manner Dorelian couldn't help thinking was meant in mockery. "You'd need a Fae's nose to smell it," she said, still smiling, "but there's a storm coming." Dorelian rolled his eyes, though he made sure the Fae couldn't see it. A storm. No doubt there were pixies in the snowdrifts and fairies in the trees too. He sniffed again, louder than before, and stomped across to the cart that carried his tent, leaving the Fae standing silently in the snow. She was right. The damn Fae was right. Dorelian peered out of the flap of his tent, then quickly pulled his head back in. Outside it was pitch black, the snow swirling in every direction, and the winds howling like mountain wolves. The temperature had dropped as they'd entered the dell too, until it was well below freezing. It wasn't much better inside his tent. He rocked back on his heels, pulling his cloak tight around himself and his blankets on top of that. In his final letter, Eskin had actually provided a list of supplies that Dorelian would need for this journey. The snow boots, the water skins, the fur cloak. Dorelian had read it with a faint sense of disgust that his old mentor could be ordering him around even from beyond the grave. Finally, he'd burnt the whole damn letter in the brazier he was using to heat his tea. He regretted that now. Eskin had sometimes been a difficult man, but he had been right about the journey, as he'd been right about so many things in life. Some of those things Derelian hadn't been able to see as an ornery youth, and he was sure there were others he couldn't see now, and not just fur cloaks and snow boots. It was infuriating. He was starting to lose the feeling in his fingers. Derelian blew on them, then shoved them in his armpits. He should have read up on the first signs of frostbite before he left Isna. He couldn't continue his research without his fingers. How would he hold a pen? He couldn't dictate his notes to some fledgling academic the way Eskin had. Students were notoriously slapdash if you could even keep them awake at their desks. The lamp hanging from the tent pole flickered. Derelian glanced up and immediately wished he hadn't. He should have closed his eyes. He should have tried to sleep despite the cold. That way he wouldn't have just seen something moving outside his tent. Derelian swallowed dryly. He'd definitely seen it, where his tent flap wouldn't quite stay closed. Something larger than the whirling snow had rushed past, a blur of white against the darkness. He squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to know. He was a coward and perfectly happy to admit it. A coward and a scholar, made for dusty libraries and lecture halls and tea houses, not tents on the sides of windswept mountains. He didn't want to be here at all. The night waxed and finally began to wane. Derelian only knew he dozed when he woke with a start, still upright and huddled inside his many layers. A thin grey light was filtering through the sides of the tent, and all was deathly quiet, until a shout echoed across the dell. It was unmistakably Marcia, ordering his assistants about. There were tools clattering, oxen shuffling, more shouts back and forth. Derelian eased himself forwards, taking as many of the blankets as he could carry, and stuck his head outside. The world had become blindingly white. Snow covered every landmark in soft mounds, and came halfway up the entrance of Derelian's tent. He pulled on his boots, adjusted his cloak with tingling fingers, and stumbled out into the snow. The first drift came up to his knees. A few paces further, and he joined a track already beaten through the snow. It led across the dell, past the long obscured remains of the fire from the night before, and climbed up towards the road. The Fey woman stood on the slope, watching the commotion that had woken Derelian. Marcia and his folk were struggling with a cart that seemed to have lodged itself in a ditch, the oxen lowing and two of the assistants wielding shovels, though Derelian couldn't see what they could do except move the snow around. There was so damn much of it. The Fey, he realised, was looking at him sidelong. "You look like you had an interesting night." Derelian scratched the stubble that was starting to itch along his jaw. He hadn't taken off his hat in days. He dreaded to think what state his hair was in. "I didn't sleep. There was something outside my tent." The Fey's expression was maddeningly knowing. "Wolves, most likely. They're not so hungry at this time of year, so I wouldn't worry. Unless it was one of those cloudlings from the upper reaches. They sound harmless enough, but those damn sprites will strip your skin from your bones as soon as look at you." Derelian stared at her. Wolves? Cloudlings? It sounded like nonsense, but there was that look in the Fey's eye. "Tormay," Marcia's voice floated across to them, carried on the chill wind. "Would you provide a touch of heat for us, lass?" The Fey raised her staff in response, and was gone before Derelian realised she was the one being addressed. Tormay, was that her name? He'd always thought Fey names were nothing but vowels. But this journey was proving how little he knew, if nothing else. The world was a very wide, strange place beyond the boundaries of what he was familiar with. The thought, despite the cold, was enough to make him sweat. By mid-morning, finally, they were moving again. One of Marcia's assistants, a sandy-haired dwarf with an even more impenetrable accent than his master, came to help the travellers strike the tents and stow them on the wagons. Derelian trudged up the slope after him and found Tormay not far from where she'd been before, surveying the waiting caravan. The road ahead was clear, a a great swathe of it damp and steaming. Dorelian studied the Fae, dark circles now ringing her eyes. Her hair seemed to be even more tangled than it had been before. "We're a long way from the fire lode," he observed. "A long way for a backwater Fae mage, you mean?" "I didn't say anything of the sort." "But you thought it." Tormé turned a sour look on him. "There's no need for you to pretend at friendship. I'm well aware of what you think of me. All I can say is that I'm sorry your world is so small and cramped. There can't be much room in there for anyone but yourself." She strode away before Dorelian could think of anything to say. He watched her stiff back disappear in the midst of the caravan. Well, fine. If the Fae wished to be rude, that was her business. She certainly wasn't improving his view of her people. He'd be very glad, in fact, to get this journey over with and never see another Fae for as long as he lived. The sooner they crossed these damned mountains, the better. There was something following them. Dorelian had first seen it shortly before they'd stopped that evening, when the blue light of dusk was falling across the mountains. He'd been at the rear of the caravan, listening to one of Marsh's assistants talk endlessly, insufferably, of his engineering project back in Skyhold. He was building a bridge, or a tower, or a forge, or whatever it was these dwarves were so enamoured by. Dorelian hadn't been listening in some time. He couldn't help glancing over his shoulder, though, looking for wolves or cloudlings, though he wished he'd asked what the latter looked like. It seemed increasingly likely that he'd imagined some creature out in the snow during the storm, but that didn't mean he couldn't take precautions. And then he saw it. It was nothing more than a shadow, grey in the failing light. It seemed to flit up the side of the snow-covered slope, vanishing into a scattering of rocks. Dorelian came to a stop, eyes straining. He almost jumped a foot in the air when the assistant called his name. "Have you lost something? I said before, that pack of yours needs a strap replacing." "I saw something moving, up there." The assistant squinted in the direction Dorelian had gestured. "I don't see anything." "It was there. It was shaped like a man." Now the assistant was squinting at him. "We've walked a fair ways today, Master. I reckon your eyes are playing tricks. The shadows are funny at this time of day anyway. As soon as it starts to snow, you'll be seeing tigers and bears and all sorts out there." But it wasn't snowing, and all the way down to the next campsite, Dorelian could feel eyes on his back. The feeling only grew worse the next day. They'd reached the top of Ghoul's Spine. They were travelling across the vertebrae, Dorelian mused in his more macabre moods. The mountains were so wide that the head of the pass, though relatively flat, took 2 days to cross with ox and carts. The weather, at least, had improved somewhat. There had been no more storms, and the sky was a cerulean cap above the heads of the peaks. Marsh had declared more than once that they'd see another storm before they started the descent, but Dorelian found himself looking to Tormé for confirmation. 2 days from now, he heard her telling a fellow traveller, "we won't see fresh snow until we're at least a mile down the other side." To Dorelian's relief, the Fae had the truth of it. The fact they were being followed was made slightly less alarming by the creature having no snowstorms to hide in. Which meant he saw their tail twice more. Once, a shadow passed across his tent in the dead of night, though the campfires were all doused and there was barely a sliver of moon. The following morning, Dorelian scoured the snow around his tent for prints, but there was nothing bigger than the tracks of the crow perched in a spindly tree nearby. Dorelian stared at it suspiciously until Marcia called the caravan to order. Were there shape changes in the region? Dwarven tales didn't mention them often, but dwarves weren't the most observant of peoples. The second time, the shadow was more lupine in nature. Dorelian caught sight of it slinking into a stand of pines as the sun went down. There was nothing lupine about the gleam of red eyes he saw watching him, though, nor about the whispers that seemed to come from the wood. Finally, as the sky turned bruise black in anticipation of more snow, and Marcia urged the caravan faster in search of shelter, Derelian found himself walking beside Tormé again. He hadn't consciously sought her out, but nor, when she asked after his well-being, could he stop himself blurting out, "There's something following us." Tormé cocked her head to one side, the bones in her hair clicking together. "Is there now? In fact, I believe it may be following me. It prowls around my tent at night and taunts me from every patch of shadow." "Has anyone else seen this creature?" "I believe not. I've told both you and one of Marcia's assistants about it, but no one else has mentioned anything." Tormé nodded slowly. "As I thought." Derelian resisted the urge to grab her arm. "So you know what it is? Have you seen it yourself?" "I have not. A stalking presence only you can see, though, suggests a haunting." Derelian absorbed that in silence. A haunting. A week ago, he would have dismissed it out of hand, like any good academic would. Now, though, with his thoughts shadowed and his body weary, it seemed all too plausible. "Are you suggesting a specific presence might be responsible?" "You're asking if it's your former mentor. Logical, yes?" "Well, I suppose so. But this is a ghost or spirit we're talking about. Logic doesn't come into it." Derelian studied the carts ahead of them, lumbering slowly around a curve in the road. Would Eskin have a reason to haunt him? After being abandoned by his student over what now seemed such a trifling misunderstanding, perhaps he would. And yet Tormé didn't seem to think so. "Do you know how the bone roads came about?" Derelian stared at her blankly. He was too weary to feign knowing what she was talking about. Tormé raised an eyebrow at him. "What do they teach in those northern schools? Nothing useful, it seems." If anyone else had needled him so, Derelian would have needled back. He had a whole list of esoteric subjects on hand for when any ignorant commoner questioned his knowledge. He was too tired for that, though, and the world was proving too strange and alarming. Isna felt a very long way away. "This is a bone road." Tormé gestured to the very track they were walking on. Every ancient road across the spine started as a bone road, in the days when the dwarves were still digging holes in the ground with their bare hands. We made them, the Fae. We were travellers then. That seemed an unlikely concept. The Fae were so hidebound, so wedded to the places they both worshipped and lived. It was rare to see them on the road. But here was Tormé, looking at him expectantly, as though waiting for him to argue over his understanding of her own people's history. Feeling guilty at the mere thought, Derelian nodded slowly. Tormé nodded back, seemingly pleased. Even as travellers, though, we knew the value of having a place to call home. Both the living and the dead need somewhere to belong, and so, when a Fae far from home was unlucky enough to die, they were carried back across the mountains to their final rest. Thus were the bone roads born. "Eskin wasn't a Fae," Derelian said. Tormé snorted dismissively. "You don't need to be Fae to know where you belong. Even elves are capable of that." Derelian felt himself flush, but Tormé was smiling. "But you said it wasn't Eskin haunting me anyway. The bone roads are for more than carrying the dead. The very act of the journey soothes the departed spirit, allowing them to achieve peace when they reach their destination. And the bearers of the dead have their own path to walk." That was reassuring, he supposed. Whether there was any value in the bone roads for a dead elf like Eskin, at least it sounded like this haunting had other origins. He wasn't sure how he'd cope with his teacher's ghost prowling through the dead of night deep in the mountains. Knowing Eskin, he'd use it as an excuse to finally finish that argument about the vocabulary of Eastern Highlands Elvish. A sudden, fierce rush of regret almost made Derelian come to a stop. He'd missed his chance to finish all those conversations, those philosophical discussions that had kept them awake long into the night, and resumed again over breakfast. So many things would forever go unsaid. Only now did that seem important, when it was too late. By the time the caravan stopped for the night, Dorelian was even more weary and footsore than he'd been before. He'd walked beside Tormay most of the afternoon, saying little to her observations about the weather and the terrain. There was something comforting about being in her presence, though. It was like being able to bolt a sturdy door against the cold and the dark of night, which made her the door, he supposed, and him the scared child quivering in the corner beside the fire, hands over his eyes. Tormay almost certainly knew she provided such reassurance. Dorelian was becoming increasingly certain she knew everything, but she'd so far been tactful enough not to mention it. He was too exhausted to even find that humiliating. All that day, the road had been wending slowly downwards, even more treacherous than climbing with the heavy wagons, and a dark line had grown ahead of them. It was only when dusk fell and the road switched back through a stand of pines that Dorelian realised they'd descended far enough to escape the storms and finally find greenery again. The forest fell away down the slope ahead of them. Where the road wound through it in the distance, it looked like a pale ribbon stretched across dark velvet. As Marcia and his assistants arranged the camp for the night, Dorelian walked a little way into the trees. The snow underfoot was thinner and didn't crunch as sharply in their shadow. Perhaps it would be easier to pitch his tent where the earth wasn't as frozen. Besides, under the cover of the trees, he could at least relieve himself without feeling as though the whole world was watching. He threw his pack to the ground. It had been sunny and almost warm during the day, but now a sharp chill had fallen. It made the hairs rise on the back of Dorelian's neck, and a shiver trickled down his spine like cold water. It wasn't the temperature. There was a shadow barely a dozen feet in front of him. He'd mistaken it for a broken pine when he entered the trees, but now he could see its humanoid shape, its long arms stretching towards him with jagged fingers. Dorelian knew with blistering certainty that he had no way to save himself. The spirit had come for him. He bolted. Too terrified even to scream, Dorelian sprinted out of the forest and into the clearing where the camp was being pitched. It blurred around him, and it wasn't until he came to a stop, sweating and trembling, that he was able to take a breath. He blinked, heart still thumping in his chest like a kicking stallion, and found he was directly outside Tormay's tent. The Fae herself wasn't there. Dorelian tried to speak and found his voice had become a strangled gurgle in the back of his throat. He looked back the way he'd come, at his footprints cutting a line through the snow. The tree line was a dark slash across the landscape. He'd left his tent and all his belongings in there. The thought came to him vaguely, distantly. In that moment, he couldn't fathom ever doing anything about it. His possessions would have to remain there, abandoned, until they rotted or were buried by the snow. He certainly wasn't going back into the trees. Of the shadow, there was nothing to be seen. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Tormay's flat tone made Dorelian spin round, fresh panic blooming in his chest. She stood to one side of her tent, the last of the light making her pale skin luminous. "Did you?" Dorelian swallowed dryly. It was there, under the trees. The same figure as before. All he could summon was a nod. "And what are you going to do about it?" Dorelian stared at her helplessly. Do? What was he supposed to do about a ghost that had followed him all the way across Ghoul's spine? He no longer cared if it belonged to Eskin, he just wanted it gone. "I need your help." The words bubbled out of him. "Please, I'm sorry I believed all those foolish things about Faye and acted like an arse and thought I was somehow better than you. I don't know what I'm doing, and you're the only one who can help me. Please." It was, quite possibly, the least erudite thing he'd uttered in his life. Tormay looked faintly satisfied, though. "You honour me with your request, and I would be honoured to help. Well then, we'd best get to work." She led him away from the caravan, following the tree line, which was as forbidding as a stone wall in the darkness. Before long, the blue had faded from the sky, replaced by a glittering band of stars. Tormé seemed to have little difficulty finding her way, but Derelian soon found himself tripping and stumbling over every minor imperfection under the snow. Even his elven eyes were too attuned to the city for this darkness. He only realised Tormé had turned aside when she loomed out of the darkness, grabbing his sleeve and pulling. Derelian yelped, but the Fae was relentless. Stumbling, he followed her into the trees, where the dark was so impenetrable he could only trust to her guidance. Abruptly, Tormé released his arm. Light flared. Derelian threw up a hand, shielding his eyes from the globe of fire magic Tormé had conjured. They were even further from the fire lode now, and yet still she had magic. For the first time, Derelian realised just how greatly he'd underestimated her, and wondered too if he ought to be afraid. Tormé bent low to the ground, using her magic for light. She muttered something to herself, then surged upright again, stalking off so quickly Derelian could hardly keep up. And so it went. Derelian soon lost track of time, as Tormé studied what seemed to him indistinguishable tree trunks and banks of snow, her face growing graver all the time. Finally, a glimmer of fear rose under Derelian's exhaustion. He'd wanted to confront this ghost, and yet, maybe that had been rash. What if it was stronger even than Tormé? He needed to get off this mountain as quickly as possible. Too late. They entered a clearing, and Tormé let her fire globe die. The faultless snow was bathed in the silver of a low-hanging moon. Tormé took a few steps into the clearing, stepping so lightly on the snow she left almost no mark. She paused for a moment, face turned towards the sky, and then turned, hands spread wide, fire sparking on her fingertips. Derelian Centaur. The magic grew, casting Tormé's face in strange shadows. Her eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and her voice was loud in the stillness. Now is the time of your reckoning. Derelian gaped at her, and then lurched sideways as a fireball came soaring towards him. He stumbled to hands and knees in the snow as the fire magic thumped into the ground behind him. Steam rose in a great gout, briefly obscuring Tormé's form, yet Derelian didn't need to see her to know she'd made no mistake. She'd attacked him deliberately. He drew himself up with as much dignity as he could muster, fear replaced by outrage. What is the meaning of this? It took all Derelian's willpower not to fall over as another fireball hit the snow at his feet. Tormé came after it, her staff raised. The meaning, Derelian Centaur? I mean to teach you the lesson your mentor failed to instill. I don't... Quiet. Tormé's voice seemed to echo off the mountains, making the ground shake. A fool and a bigot, too fond of the sound of your own voice to listen to the needs of others, or even to understand the clamour of your own thoughts. I apologised. To get your own way. This haunting scared you enough to ask for my help. Would you have done it otherwise? Would you have ever shown friendship to a Fae? Derelian opened his mouth, but Tormé's face glowed in the light of another fireball, expanding in her palm. He pressed his lips together. Something in Tormé's expression was enough to finally stun him into silence. And Tormé's anger was only growing. A fool beyond all proportion. There never was a ghost. Do you see that now? The Bone Rose have done exactly what they were intended to do. Forced you to confront your own pride, your own regrets, your own mistakes. What right do you have to speak of my mistakes? Another fireball, this one smaller and swifter than the last. It hissed into the snow in front of Derelian, followed by another and another. Finally, he began backing towards the trees, and for every step of retreat, Tormé made one in pursuit, words dripping from her tongue like acid. Enough pride to make you abandon your mentor over a petty argument. Derelian yelped as a fireball came close enough to singe the edge of his cloak. Enough stubbornness to ensure you never apologised though you were in the wrong. Torme's face was a skull, all black hollows and hard edges. Enough guilt that you abandoned him to die alone though you should have been by his side. A tree hit Derelian between the shoulder blades, showering him with snow. Torme came on. All of it locked away in that thick skull of yours, trapped by the one thing you can't admit to feeling. There was nowhere to retreat. Torme was barely 3 feet away, the end of her staff glowing like lit coals. It formed points of red light in her eyes as she lowered it towards Derelian's face. "Do you see it?" she hissed again. "There never was a ghost. Your haunting is naught but your own regrets, tormenting you until you're half mad." Derelian swallowed. He didn't think he was the mad one here, and yet, what is it you think I can't admit? "Grief," Torme said without hesitation. "You abandoned your mentor. You refused to apologise, or even to accept that an apology was needed. And now that he's gone, you're too stubborn to admit you feel any sorrow at all." Before he could stop himself, Derelian pictured Eskin on that last night, sitting before the brazier. He always wanted it lit, no matter the heat outside, but on that night he'd been hunched over, so close he almost touched the coals. They'd argued and argued over something so small Derelian couldn't even remember it now, and yet somehow Eskin had known it was an argument too far. Derelian had never let himself think it in all the years since, but on that night his old teacher had looked like a broken man. "What do you want me to say?" His voice was hoarse. The damp on his face seemed too warm to be snow. Torme's staff abruptly dimmed, as though doused in cold water. Her voice was soft. "I want nothing, Derelian. You asked me to cure your haunting, and that is what I've done. The ghost was never anywhere but inside your own head." Derelian's world seemed to tilt. He found himself on his knees without understanding how he'd got there. The tears fell more freely now, dripping onto his upturned hands. Torme was right. So many years, so many mistakes. He almost wished the ghost had been real, that Eskin had followed him as an avenging spirit. He would have deserved it. Torme's hand settled on his shoulder as lightly as a resting bird. "The bone roads have done their work. It is time for peace, for both of you." Derelian closed his eyes. More than anything, he hoped she was right. It was warmer south of the mountains, the roads not yet submerged in winter mud, and the trees still crowned in glorious fiery hues. It was 3 days since Derelian had left the rest of the caravan, with strict instructions from Marcia regarding the return of the wagon at a later date. The roads this far southeast were rougher than the ones over the mountains, but the wagon was sturdy, the oxen strong, and the load. It was lighter than most carried over the bone roads, Derelian supposed, just as his own felt lighter than the day he'd set out. It was a source of constant surprise how much less turbulent his mind felt than it had just a week before, but not as surprising as Torme still accompanying him, or that he actually welcomed her presence. He'd asked her, once they'd left the rest of the caravan, how she'd known so much, and whether she had, in fact, read his mind. Her smile had been faintly mocking. "A student carrying his teacher over the bone roads with a manner such as yours. An old story, if you've lived long enough to see it. You were easier to read than one of your scholars' books." Derelian let the affront of that wash over him. No one wanted to be told they were predictable, but following the old patterns of life as it had existed for thousands of years, that wasn't so bad. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as golden autumnal light settled across the rolling hills, they finally led the wagon into the village. Torme had been their guide. Her home was only another day away, in the forest to the south, and she knew the area well. She didn't seem concerned about her welcome in the village either. They were used to Fae out here, according to her. Only city folk, made ignorant by their own presumption of cosmopolitan knowledge, were not. There was a crowd waiting to meet them. Dorelian didn't know how his arrival had been marked, but it certainly had. There were a selection of villagers beside the road, including 2 who looked like dignitaries, and to Dorelian's surprise, a middle-aged woman who bore Eskin's distinctive crooked nose. It was to her Dorelian went, and the white-haired old woman at her side. He bowed to both of them, not quite sure what to say. Eskin's final letter had spoken of this as the place he'd been born. To find waiting a wife and daughter he'd never even mentioned. But whose fault was that, Dorelian wondered? Was it the teacher who'd been too guarded, too private, or the student who'd been too arrogant to invite such confidences? It was Tormé at his side who spoke first. The bone roads have been walked, the rites are performed, his spirit is at rest. Eskin's daughter nodded slowly. The old woman closed her eyes. 30 years, she said, her voice cracking. I always knew we would never hold him, but 30 years. 'Tis a long time to wait to see the man you loved come home in a coffin. There was no bitterness in the voice, only acceptance of a man who'd been as difficult and stubborn as Dorelian now knew himself to be. And driven, too. Eskin's wife was right. Eskin had been too consumed by his work to want to stay forever in a tiny village, no matter how idyllic, no matter what family he left behind there. Teacher and student had that much in common too. Thank you, Eskin's daughter said. There were tears on her cheeks, though her voice was steady. Thank you for bringing my father home. Dorelian nodded, his throat closing. He knew, now, why he'd come all this way. Not for Eskin's sake, who in his pragmatic way wouldn't have cared where he was buried. No, he'd asked to be carried across the bone roads for his family, who he'd left behind so long ago, and perhaps to teach his student one final lesson. The burial took place that very afternoon. Dorelian watched the ceremony from afar. He'd done what Eskin had wanted. The lesson had been learnt. As the last of the lamps around the grave were lit, glowing like fireflies in the autumn night, a fresh light appeared at Dorelian's side. Tormé's magic cast her face in warm hues. She could look reassuring when she wanted to. He was a clever man, your teacher, she said. Not a perfect one, but certainly clever. Once the observation would have made Dorelian bitter. Now he only nodded. It's a fine night for walking, Tormé went on. Dorelian looked sideways at her. You're going home tonight? I am. My own hearth is calling me. She paused, the globe of light bobbing in her palm, then added, If you were minded to learn more of the Fae, I expect I could find you a bed. Dorelian knew how generous the offer was. Gods knew he'd given Tormé little enough cause to make it. She possessed a graciousness he could only dream of, and there was, he was certain, a great deal he could learn from her people. And yet he shook his head. I believe, he said slowly, there are almost certainly Fae living in Isna, if one takes the trouble to look. He thought Tormé was smiling as she said, and I believe you are almost certainly right. They turned to one another. In the light from Tormé's magic, a handful of snowflakes were beginning to fall, spiralling down out of a leaden sky. The first snow of the season this far south. It would be a long and arduous journey back home. Long, but worth it, Dorelian thought. Worth every moment. He held out a hand, the greeting he would have given Tormé the day they met if he hadn't been so pig-headed. She took it. It was a pleasure to meet you, Tormé of the Fae. Thank you for everything you've taught me. And you, Dorelian Centaur. Tormé inclined her head. Thank you for being willing to learn. I'm glad there wasn't a real ghost. So am I. Derelian released her hand and pulled his cloak tighter. The snow was coming down faster now, almost obscuring the village behind a whirl of white. Safe travels. Perhaps we'll meet again one day. Perhaps we will. Tomei raised her staff, and the tiniest, most delicate ribbon of fire magic melted the first settling snowflakes from Derelian's arms. I'm sure, should that day come, you'll be the one with something to teach me. A smile touched Derelian's lips. It seemed inappropriate so soon after a funeral, but he couldn't seem to stop it. I'll make sure that's the case. He bowed, low and respectful, and remained there until the snow had started to settle on his shoulders again. By the time he straightened, the grass and the trees around him were fringed with white, and Tomei was gone.